Hi, welcome to the Smith Family Foundation debate series. Tonight's debate on pornography features Brooke Gladstone. She is the moderator. She's the co-host and editor of NPR's nationally syndicated Hour of Media Criticism and Analysis on the Media, which was awarded a Peabody this year for its body of work. Prior to that, she was NPR's first media reporter, senior editor of NPR's afternoon news show, All Things Considered, and senior editor for Weekend Edition with Scott Simon. Brooke also reported from NPR covering Moscow from 92 to 95, covering among other things the bloody uprising of the Russian parliament. She's been the recipient of Overseas Press Club Award, a Peabody Award, a Knight Journalism Fellowship, and a Milwaukee Press Club Award. So without further ado, here's Brooke Gladstone.
Hi. I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion because I just read recently that you can now get pornography on your iPod and you can get it on your cell phone. Of course, it's been the engine that's driven commercial development on the internet, as it has been the engine of the development of virtually every communications technology, beginning with still photography. Nevertheless, it poses some risks to some people. So the question is, when you have things in the culture or just freely available that pose risks, like cigarettes, like alcohol, like heroin, which ones do you control, which ones do you don't, and what is the impact anyway? And how does personal responsibility play into it, and where is society's role? We have a really fascinating panel, and they'll each have a few minutes to talk about their general position. Pamela Paul, right here, is a journalist and the author of The Starter Marriage and the Future of Matrimony, which was selected by the Washington Post as one of the best books of 2002. She's also a contributing editor to Time magazine and formerly a senior editor at American Demographics magazine, where she covered social, political, and media trends. She's also a monthly contributor to The Economist, where she covers books, arts, trends, and film. Nick Gillespie is editor-in-chief of Reason, a libertarian monthly named one of the 50 best magazines for 2 straight years by the Chicago Tribune. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, Slate, Salon, and many other publications. He's a frequent commentator on radio and television programs such as NPR's All Things Considered, CNN's American Morning, Fox's The O'Reilly Factor, and C-SPAN's Washington Journal. He's also worked as a reporter for a number of New Jersey newspapers and as an editor at several Manhattan-based music, movie, and teen magazines. He is certainly the only journalist to have interviewed both Ozzy Osbourne and the 2002 Nobel laureate in economics, Vernon Smith. So there's range.
They're both very hunky.
You got down with both of them.
I think so.
Robert Peters, next to Nick, is president of Morality in Media, a nonprofit interfaith organization founded in New York City in 1962 to combat illegal hardcore pornography and uphold standards of decency in the media. He's also often interviewed by local, national, and international print and electronic media. We actually shared the stage once on a CBC program. And he's also been on NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, ABC News Primetime Live, CBS TV Evening News 48 Hours, NBC TV Evening News, The Today Show, Larry King Live. And lastly, Rachael Kramer Bussel is a New York City-based writer, editor, and blogger, senior editor at Penthouse Variations, and a contributing editor and columnist for Penthouse. She writes the Lusty Lady column in The Village Voice. She's the editor of several anthologies, including Naughty Spanking Stories from A to Z, volumes 1 and 2. And her erotic writing has been published in over 50 anthologies, including Best American Erotica 2004 and 2006. So there's your panel. Pamela, do you want to frame the discussion about the impact of pornography in an age of everyday ready access?
Sure. Well, I'm not to actively promote my book here, but I just want to mention, since it's probably most relevant to tonight, the most recent book I wrote is called Pornified, How Pornography is Transforming Our Lives, Our Relationships, and Our Families, which I don't think you mentioned, but
No, I
just came
didn't.
out and is probably the reason I'm here. Before I want to start off really by talking about what it is that I mean when I talk about pornography, because I think a lot of people have misconceptions. People think I'm talking about, gauzy centerfolds or, stories about people having sex. I think that while pornography has slipped into the mainstream culture, the images that remain confined to the porn world have become increasingly intense. Old school defenders of pornography may not be familiar with the direction in which internet and DVD era pornography has gone. They might not understand the infinite possibilities offered by online porn and the intoxicating effects of the anonymity, accessibility, and affordability of the internet. They have most likely not watched recent hardcore videos, such as Gag Factor 15, the latest in a popular series of pornographic movies in which the action takes place in a room full of men in headscarves and masks holding photos of torture from Abu Ghraib. They probably haven't heard the soundtrack of such a film in which one man screams nonsensically in what's supposed to be Arabic, while another translates, "We will do to your women what you have done to our men. You degraded our people, now we'll degrade yours. The streets will spill over with spit." They probably have not continued to watch as the film shows the men standing over a woman dressed in military clothes and dog tags shouting, "I was only following orders." Or seen the penultimate move where one of the Arab men brandishes a sword and threatens to slice off the girl's head before the film's true climax, multiple oral sex scenes in which the girl is shown to choke on genitalia and semen. Now, some people might say, oh, you just picked the most extreme example of pornography you could possibly find. Spend about 10 minutes online and you'll see that this is pretty run-of-the-mill. Porn itself has changed radically over the last 20 years, but outdated ideas about pornography have gone unchallenged, and so-called eternal truths have been perpetuated without protest. Back in the 70s and 80s, porn was a topic of much discussion. Both men and women debated its merits and harms, its legality and morality, its inevitability and its outcomes, but by the late 90s, the debate quieted down. In Christian corners and enclaves of the social right, outcry occasionally emerges and is ignored by the mainstream as so many Puritans in search of the next Salem. Elsewhere, when talking about pornography, one hears complacencies and certainties such as, porn is harmless, it's just looking at pictures, what's wrong with fantasy? Or, if we women want to be naked and be proud of our bodies, what's the problem? We're in control, and it's our choice. Or, all men look at porn, it's human nature, men are biologically programmed to be visually stimulated. Or, if you believe in civil liberties and freedom of the press, you've got to be in favor of porn. Or, women are objectified everywhere, advertisements, movies, fashion magazines. Porn is no different, and there's nothing that can be done about it anyway. We hear these arguments all the time. We hear them from men who don't look at porn themselves and those who do, from women who would be appalled to find out their boyfriends watch pay-per-view porn in hotels while traveling on business. We hear them from parents who would shudder to know that their 10-year-old sons are clicking on internet porn when they're allegedly doing homework. Americans are nonetheless confident they already know everything there is to know about pornography. After all, porn has been around in one form or another for as long as the oldest profession has been in working order. It's difficult, therefore, to approach a subject like pornography from a fresh perspective. Both men and women have so many preconceptions. A person is either for porn or against it, a prude or a player, a religious fanatic or a radical feminist, Larry Flynt or Andrea Dworkin. There's no middle ground on the playing fields of consumers and abstainers, civil libertarians and Comstockian curmudgeons. Yet framing the debate in terms of distorted polarities ignores the vast middle ground where pornography plays a significant and growing role. One need not be a prude or a religious zealot to experience revulsion at the sight of certain pornography, just as one need not be a depraved pervert or a lefty activist to use pornography. The fact is, none of the current assumptions reflect how porn really affects people in their relationships, and to continue to abide by them would mean ignoring an issue that is transforming most Americans' lives. Instead of relying on political posturing and abstract arguments, I've sought answers to some simple questions. Who uses pornography and why? What do men see in it? Are more women indulging? And how does pornography affect people? Will looking at online porn at age 9 affect boys and girls when they reach sexual maturity? And what is the impact of a pornified culture on relationships and on society as a whole? I first asked those questions for a story that I wrote for Time magazine called The Porn Factor that came out in 2004. And shortly after that story was published, I was in the middle of a self-Google when I came across the following. This I abbreviated in the book, but I'm going to read it in full here. Internet at risk of total mommy control. And this is on a website called marriedtomommy.com. Warning to married guys everywhere. This week's Time magazine features an article on why it's not good for married men to look at adult sites on the internet. The article is written by none other than Pamela Paul. That's right, Pamela. Do you think that maybe Pamela is a mommy? Let me tell you, boys, the mommies are coming for our internet. We've been beaten by them into submission about drinking, smoking, speeding, and just about every other fun guy's activity. We are now law-abiding, tax-paying, proper citizens who are willing to do just about whatever we are told, just to make the pain stop. Then along comes a beacon of light in the wilderness. It's called the internet, and it features, for nothing more than the monthly cost of service, pictures of girls wearing things that our wives won't wear anymore and doing things our wives won't do anymore. Yes, this harmless activity can be done in the safety of our own homes, which is typically a mommy requirement anyway, and costs far less than the night at the local gentleman's club, so it doesn't drain the family budget. Sound good? Absolutely not. The objective of mommydom is to control every aspect of a guy's life, regardless of whether or not it achieves anything good for him or mommy. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. In mommy's mind, to control their man is good. So what then of the internet? 'Tis bad, 'tis very bad. You are a bad dog. Turn off that porn, you selfish man, you. You are single-handedly ruining this relationship by making mommy feel powerless because you don't have to wait for her to hand out sex. You can just substitute by looking at it on the internet. They're coming, boys. The mommies are coming to take our internet away. And now they've recruited Time magazine and all the psychologists whose opinions are included in these ridiculous articles. I find it kind of funny how they think journalism works, to make us feel guilty for partaking in a purely harmless activity. Why? Because mommies must have control. And when they're done and you've given up using the internet because they've convinced you that you are bad for using it in such a destructive way, you'll sit there with nothing left in your life and ask, what happened? So I have to say that kind of inspired me to write the book. What I did when researching the book was I basically had 4 parts to my research. The major part of it was talking to people who use porn, mostly. Talked to a little over 100 people, 112 people, about 80% of them men, most of them porn users, about, why do they look at pornography beyond the obvious reasons? What do they get out of it? Have they seen any effect in their life, positive or negative? What are their relationships like? And it was interesting. These conversations generally lasted for a few hours, but sometimes over the course of several days, men really opened up, because I think that a lot of men don't talk about this, and I think that many of them don't even think about it to themselves. Why do I like to look at 3 Asian women in a hot tub? When did I start looking at porn every morning before I would go to work? So that was really the bulk of the research, and then I balanced that with a nationwide poll of 2,556 people. Wanting to, a lot of this kind of thing you can't get from polls, but I did want to have some quantitative data to back it up. The third thing I did was look at some of the social science research that's out there about pornography, which is really fairly minimal. Most of the research dates back to the 80s, and a lot of it was really trying to prove a relationship between pornography and rape or sexual violence, which is an area that did not interest me. I don't think that you can prove causation there, and I think a lot of the social science isn't convincing. What I wanted to look at was, I think, this vast middle ground that political arguments have overlooked, which is, what's the impact on individuals who use it and on those who are in families or in relationships with people who use it. The last thing I did, which was exhausting, was have LexisNexis, the database, send me every article every day that contained the word pornography. That was about 70 to 400 articles a day worldwide, to just get a sense of how pornography is playing out in the larger culture. So armed with this, I wrote this book, and it's been interesting to me, the reaction of a lot of people. I think people, again, as I said earlier, have established opinions. Many people don't want to actually hear anything critical about pornography, and therefore will go out and immediately label me, as Married to Mommy did, in so many words, although some just come right to the point and say, well, you're a prude, a reactionary, anti-sex, totalitarian control freak, which is really interesting and basically proves that they didn't read the book. So the last thing I want to read here, and I'll try to go quickly, is what I kind of find the least interesting aspect of pornography. What I'm interested in is again, this effect that it has on people's lives, the role it plays. But I want to just talk a little bit about the politics of porn, because I think it's kind of boring, and I'd like to sort of be preemptive and get it out of the way. So I hope not to bore you to tears. But this is an essay that I did actually for Eric Alterman's blog, which I called The Liberal Argument Against Pornography, which I'm probably revealing my political stripes, but that's fine. It's a very simple and very wrong equation. If you're liberal, you've got to be pro-porn. Being pro-pornography means you're sex-positive, open-minded, and progressive. You care about the First Amendment, women's rights, and sexual freedom. And you most certainly stand against the reactionary forces of the anti-porn movement, repressive, anti-civil libertarian, moralizing hypocrites, all of them. which I think is nonsense, and more specifically, outdated and misguided nonsense. The drawing of political battle lines over pornography dates back in large part to two conflicting federal reports designed to study and address the issue. In 1968, the United States President's Commission on Obscenity and Pornography was charged with understanding the effects of pornography upon the public, and particularly minors, in its relationship to crime and other antisocial behaviors. After 2 years of research, the Commission issued a report that concluded, in sum, empirical research designed to clarify the question has found no evidence to date that exposure to explicit sexual materials plays a significant role in the causation of delinquent or criminal behavior among youths or adults. 16 years later, the Reagan administration commissioned what later came to be known as the Meese Report for the Attorney General's Commission on Pornography, which came to the exact opposite conclusion. Pornography, the Meese Report explained, leads to sexual violence, rape, deviation, and the destruction of families. Yet while the earlier report exonerating porn was widely distributed and published by a commercial press, the Meese Report was difficult to track down, unpublished commercially, and immediately distorted and vilified in a popular pro-porn book published by Penthouse and distributed on newsstands everywhere. As a result of these two contradictory reports, many Americans, especially liberals, came to the conclusion that the first report was accurate, while the second was politically motivated hackwork designed to crack down on family values and promulgated by a man who was himself under investigation for corruption. Who is he to top? While there may well be truth to the political motivation behind the second study, concluding that all the results were inaccurate distorts the report's finding. In truth, the second report contained valuable nonpartisan data from reliable academicians and social scientists. Regardless of the motivations behind and differing conclusions of each of the two reports, it's hard to argue with the fact that both are totally outdated. The first was generated back when Playboy didn't include full frontal nudity and before most hardcore magazines had even been launched. Penetration shots were rare. Hustler wasn't even created until 4 years after the first commission issued its final report. Not only was the magazine world relatively tame at the time of the 1970 report, but both it and the Meese Report were drawn before cable TV, the VCR, and especially the internet took porn to a whole new level. Finally, the 1970 goals were narrow, trying to forge a link between pornography and sexual violence without exploring the vast area of influence that stops well short of violence. There was no effort to study or document other negative effects of porn on men, women, or children. In the wake of these two reports and their distortion in the popular media, pornography became a politically progressive cause, a convenient tool in the culture wars. Pornographers successfully fomented a bogus fight between Victorian prudishness and modern sexual freedom that is taken up by everyone from libertarians to webheads to feminists to liberal Democrats, and the battle lines haven't budged for decades. Not surprisingly, am I out of time? Okay, well, let's see. I'll end with this. Denouncing porn is akin to what is derisively referred to as sexual correctness. Yet it's hard to find anything more retrograde, repressive, or closed-minded than the sexual cliches peddled by pornographers. Rather than mark an escape from the past, the dominant morality of pornography reeks of Puritan and Victorian prudery. It creates a world populated by virgins and whores, by women who are used and then shamed for being sexually voracious. Their degradation is deserved, according to the prim sexual vision of the pornographer. Even when the woman isn't overtly degraded, she is deemed lesser than the man watching her by dint of being paid to please him sexually in a public forum. Even when pornography is made specifically for women, as in the case of indie magazines like Sweet Action, the model often replicates that experience, unthinkingly substituting men bodies for women. In pornography, sexuality accompanies or provokes disgust and hatred, something to be done with quickly and just as quickly disposed of. In the world of porn, sex is generally dirty, cheap, and in the end, not much fun. Surely it is this pornified version of sexuality that deserves denigration, mockery, and rebellion. Surely any good liberal could in all good conscience exercise his right to free speech and condemn porn for what it really is.
I'm sorry that you didn't get a chance.
That's
I'm
okay.
sorry you didn't get a chance to get to impact on the families, but we'll definitely be talking about that later on. Nick?
Thanks. And I want to thank the Smith Family Foundation for inviting me to this. I'm kind of an odd choice, I'll tell you, for talking about pornography. I think the only piece of pornography, if it's even pornography anymore, that I purchased was the October issue of Playboy, because they wrote up our Reason.com's Hit and Run blog as the best libertarian blog on the web. And shortly, I didn't look at the pictures. I just went to the page and made a photocopy of the important page. And as I flipped through it, I realized that Playboy certainly was less erotic and less interesting and less thrilling than a Victoria's Secret catalog, both in the writing as well as in the kind of symbolic nature of depictions. But, one of the things that I want to I'll run through some stuff about porn, but let's not fall into the false old contradiction between we're either in favor of the First Amendment or we're repressive or whatever. We do have to make a real point in it. We live in an age where we have unparalleled expression, ability to produce and consume culture, produce and consume individual identities, communities, in a way that has never been available before. And we should be hardcore about free expression, and that is what the debate about porn is ultimately about. Because it's about, do you believe in a system where people have maximum expression, individuals and individuals who come together voluntarily? Do you have the right to produce and consume the kind of culture, the kind of world you want, as long as you're not screwing over other people, unless they want to be? So, one of the things about porn, one of the arguments against porn, is always these negative social effects, and Pamela's book is certainly filled with those. But let's, it's one thing if you talk to people who consume porn for 8 hours a day or 6 hours a day or 30 seconds a day or whatever. I mean, people who are porn addicts or regular users. If you pull back from that, and those people often, are any people here porn addicts, by the way? This is as good a place to come out as you can. But then if you pull back from porn users and you look at larger society, I mean, think about it. Okay, this is supposed to be fast internet access porn and stuff like that. Here are some demographic and crime data since the rise of the internet, in the mid-90s. Sex crimes against children are down 39% over the last decade. They're down 79% against 12 to 17-year-olds. If pornography was so huge and was turning men into rapists or into dehumanizing sexual predators, those numbers wouldn't be going down, I think. Abortion has been trending down. Teen pregnancy is down. Divorce is down 47%. 47% of marriages ended in divorce in 1990. It's 38% in 2002. Violent crime against women, which again, if porn had the social effects, the negative social effects we're talking about, you would think something would happen that wouldn't be this trend. 41 victims per 1,000 women in 1994, according to FBI stats. It was 17 in 2004. So it's tremendously, society has become much safer for women in terms of violent crime. Rape in 1984, 2.4 per 1,000 women were raped in 1984. That was 1.6 out of 1,000 in 1993, and it was down to 0.4 of one in 2004. Again, a social trend that doesn't follow from the idea that porn is somehow dehumanizing people and relationships behind people. One of the things that often gets talked about, whether it's sex on TV or violence on TV or fantasy images, is the effect on kids. According to the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey in 1991, 54% of high school students reported having intercourse. In 2003, that figure, after the decade of Clinton, it had fallen to 46.7%.
Is anal and oral included in that?
Yeah. Well, no, actually some of that, but yeah. And then if you, a CDC study came out in September, or October rather, which talked about oral sex with kids. 55% of 15 to 19-year-olds had oral sex or reported oral sex, and that figure went up. If you went up to 21 or 24, it was 70%. But they reported having had oral sex. And there's no comparative data for girls. Girls and boys had the same percentages, by the way, which was the big surprise, more than the total percentage. But they did have comparable data from 1995 for boys, and it was the same amount. So we're not seeing a massive increase. We see the belly shirts, and we see women or girls dressing like, sluts, whores, men as pimps. But the sexual data does not follow from that. And this is something that's really important, and it's not to be simplistic and say everything is just fantasy and it doesn't matter, because the images that we look at and the images we create, we do have a relationship with them, and they can have an effect. Anybody here who's read a novel and cried at the end, you understand that art can affect you, images can affect you. But it's not some kind of simplistic thing where it's, and I think we all know this. You can watch more sex on TV. A recent study came out showing that sex was, images of sex was higher on TV. We know watching sex on TV does not necessarily translate into sex in our lives, even when we take things into our own hands. Okay, now, but what we end up talking about with pornography, and we have to, has to do, there are real definitional problems with obscenity, not pornography, because the legal framework for this is obscenity. Banning obscenity and beefing up banning obscenity, which both of the anti-porn people on the panel are in favor of beefing up prosecution of obscenity laws. But that inevitably means banning art. Inevitably. Ulysses, Lolita, Lady Chatterley's Lover, Howl, The movie version of the Tin Drum in 1997 was ruled as obscene in Oklahoma City. You know, and for a while there, if you rented the Tin Drum from a video store in Oklahoma City, you were guilty of child porn, of having child porn. That was later overturned. Madame Bovary, you know, was banned. Naked Lunch, Tropic of Cancer. You know, I think we could all probably pick one of those books and say we wish they had been banned, you know, for good, but you get the point. So, I mean, there are immediately definitional issues with obscenity. And you know, I think we can say that, you know, earlier today, like I said, I've only bought one piece of porn in my life. I get a lot of free samples from spam. I got to come on for a site for granny trannies, and also for oozing cum whores who love donkey dick. Okay, we will all probably agree that those are pornographic, and maybe we've already been poisoned just by thinking about that. But, you know, what do you do with that? You know, what is to be done? Both Pamela and Bob, do you go by Bob or Robert?
Either one.
Okay. Are in favor of beefing up prosecution or of somehow limiting expression. You know, and they'll say it's because it's pornography, it's obscene, it's not protected by the First Amendment. We can talk about that. But this is what is happening. The Bush administration has prosecuted something like 41 since 2001, has prosecuted 41 federal obscenity charges compared to 4 during the Clinton administration. John Ashcroft, before 9/11, pulled law enforcement resources from terrorism, among other things, to bust porn and also medical marijuana users. You know, and if we're living in a world where we have limited law enforcement resources, do we want to make porn prosecutions, especially among consenting adults, both in the production and consumption of this stuff, do we want to make that a high priority? We are facing a world both where we have more right and more ability to express ourselves, but there's also a clampdown. The FCC and Congress are talking about extending broadcast content regulations to cable, satellite, and the internet. In fact, the Communications Decency Act in the 90s, a Clinton and Janet Reno production, was struck down by the courts. Had that gone into effect, it essentially would have meant that the internet was treated like a broadcast network, and our lives would all be much poorer, and not because of the granny trannies, but because it would be very hard to have freewheeling discussion of ideas. And then let me end them with a plea here. At Reason, am I out of time? Okay.
That's all right.
Okay. The same forces, at Reason, one of the things that we track is something that we call cultural proliferation, which is the idea that, you know, there's just more ability. Everybody has more ability to create and consume culture that they want in more and more increasing ways. And this is incredibly liberating, and there are always dark sides to all of this type of stuff. But the same kind of trends, the same technological trends, the same social trends that allow for more expression of more ideas, to kind of live in a John Stuart Mill, a world of experiments and living. It also allows us to control things more. This is one of the things. I'm a parent. I've got a 12-year-old boy and a 4-year-old boy. They have access to media, to art, to culture, to images, you know, just in a way when I was a kid, and, you know, I didn't have anything like that. And my choices were so much greater than my parents who had grown up in the Depression. But the same technology that gets us all of that stuff also allows us to control things. And I'm not pretending that I have some kind of authoritarian panopticon control of my kids, but I can do a lot, and it's pretty easy. And this also gets to the point of individual responsibility and living in a free society. If we want to live in a free society and an open society, the point is not to enforce a single view of morality. The point is to come up with a social system that allows people who have different ideas of morality to coexist peacefully. And that means free expression, and it means things like the First Amendment, and broadening the ability of people with different visions of the good life or the good society to get along with minimal harm. And that's one of the reasons why I think we need to be careful when we start talking about pornography, because pretty soon then you're talking about political speech, like the McCain-Feingold bill or whatever. I mean, there are forces of repression in this country that want to stop expression. And it's better to talk about expression, I think, than simply speech or art or anything like that. So I'll end there.
Okay. Go ahead.
I'm a bit of a latecomer to this panel. The student who many of you were coming to hear got sick, and I took his place. But I'd like to just quickly respond to a few things that Nick said, and not in any detail. But in terms of statistics, gosh, who is it? Brookhiser from the Times takes the view that everything is getting better. And I mean, he makes a point. You know, you got to look at both sides of the coin. But I take, for example, you know, the decline in school violence. That's an indication that kids aren't affected by the media. I think it's an indication that more and more schools have metal detectors at the doors and police in the hallways. And because kids are told that if any problem comes up, you report it immediately. You know, to say that, you know, also with predators, child pornography, you know, the drop and decline of children being molested. Well, there isn't a week goes by that in the New York City papers, you know, there was a sting, a successful sting. It's happening all over the country. The reason there are less children being molested, if that's true, is because they're all falling for the bait of a cop, male or female, portraying a child. Date rape, gosh, the emphasis at the colleges. I don't know if date rape, you know, if I were a girl, I'd have a hard time, I think, you know, going into that publicly. But, you know, tremendous, you know, effort on college campuses to deal with that. I mean, it's got nothing to do, per se, with whether kids can be affected by alcohol or pornography in a date rape. In my opinion, clearly they can be affected by either one. Also, intercourse and pregnancy, you know, looking at the statistic, fewer kids are, you know, in terms of what age group, they're less likely to have intercourse, less likely to get pregnant. But then you read all these stories that the kids getting younger and younger having oral sex. I mean, how many articles I've seen over the last couple of years where oral sex has become the form of non-sex for kids, and the disturbing part of it is it's getting earlier and earlier. Nick rattled off a list of publications, I think all of it being literature. I believe all of those were situations before the Supreme Court adopted the serious artistic, literary, political, and value part of the obscenity test. If it's not lacking in this type of value, it can't be obscene, no matter how sexual, offensive, and potentially harmful it is. And a last point, which is nitpicking, but the Tin Drum film was found to be child pornography, not obscenity. Now, what I thought in terms of what I would do in terms of my presentation, and I will have to move quickly, since our focus is law, and the subject here is the effects of pornography to some extent, I thought I would go into some of the justifications that the Supreme Court has given for obscenity laws, and we'll have to be brief. Beginning with the Neer versus Minnesota case in 1931, which didn't deal with obscenity. It was about a newspaper that had said some bad things about public officials, and the state of Minnesota wanted to shut down the newspaper. And the Supreme Court concluded that this was true censorship, prior restraint on the part of government. It distinguished between that prior restraint and punishment after publication, which it said wasn't really censorship. But the point being, they said that there were some exceptions to the censorship rule, the prior restraint on the part of government. One of them was in a time of combat. You're not supposed to tell when the troop ship is leaving so that the submarines can blow it up. The other specific example is an exception to this general ban on censorship. And in the words of the Supreme Court, the primary requirements of decency may be enforced against obscene publications. Moving ahead to Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, 1942. Again, it wasn't an obscenity case, but it articulated the justification in a nutshell, and I am going to read this paragraph, quote, "There are certain well-defined and narrowly limited classes of speech, the prevention and punishment of which have never been thought to raise any constitutional problem. These include the lewd and obscene. It has been well observed that such utterances are no essential part of any exposition of ideas and are of such slight social value as a step to truth that any benefit that may be derived from them is clearly outweighed by the social interest in order and morality." Picking up on Roth, and I will just make, because I don't have the time to go into the details, but this, you know, it's in the history of our First Amendment. We can ignore the history, what the intention of the First Amendment is, but it's clear that the Supreme Court, in terms of talking about the First Amendment, that the purpose of the First Amendment was to protect what's going on up here, not what's going on over at 8th Avenue, where they still have the hardcore porn businesses. Now, many of you may believe that the First Amendment should protect that. I would say the way to change it is through the democratic process. Let the people of New York repeal obscenity laws, and the people of the United States repeal obscenity laws at the federal level. Judges should not be rewriting the First Amendment to say that it protects something that it was never intended to protect. In Roth versus United States, they really didn't deal much with the justification, but they did pick up on the Chaplinsky's social interest in order and morality language. In a concurring opinion, and it's probably worth reading if for the historical purpose, this was Justice Harlan in the Roth case where the Supreme Court held that obscene material is not protected by the First Amendment. It seems to me clear that it is not irrational to consider that pornography can induce a type of sexual conduct which a state may deem obnoxious to the moral fabric of society. However, furthermore, even assuming that pornography cannot be deemed to cause, in an immediate sense, criminal sexual conduct, the state can reasonably draw the inference over a long period of time the indiscriminate dissemination of materials, the essential nature of which is to degrade sex, will have an eroding effect on moral standards. Now I come to the last case, which is the #1 case, the Supreme Court, where it really focused on the governmental justifications for obscenity laws. And interestingly, it involved a case where the defendant said that this was consenting adults and obscenity laws don't apply. And this is a statement that the court made. We hold that there are legitimate state interests at stake in stemming the tide of commercialized obscenity, even assuming it is feasible to enforce effective safeguards against exposure to juveniles and to passers-by. Now, I digress here for a moment to make the point that whether we are talking about magazine porn, which was the form of pornography when I was a kid, dial-up porn, video porn, cable porn, internet porn, and soon cell phone and iPod porn, we have done an absolutely miserable, failing job of shielding children from this material. So at one level, it doesn't make any difference what the court said afterwards. And you know, on the internet, even as an adult, you can't avoid this stuff because they trick you into coming into your sites. But just assume, for the sake of argument, that we could keep the kids away from it, protect the rest of the large majority of adults who do not want to be exposed to this. Here are some justifications the Supreme Court offered for the obscenity law. In state interest, the interest of the public in the quality of life and total community environment, the tone of commerce in the great city centers, remember Times Square, and possibly the public safety itself, and this was 1973. I think that the evidence that there is a link between pornography and violent sexual crime is much stronger today than it was in '73. Court went on to talk about, actually mentioned family life. Hard to believe. I guess Justice Kennedy will have to take his scissors or something and cut that out, because I guess he doesn't think that the government has a valid interest in protecting family life. But in the Paris Adult Theater case, the court said that one concern in terms of obscenity laws was family life. And the big thing, not the big thing, another governmental interest, and one that I think, again, the Supreme Court simply chooses to ignore more and more. Interestingly, the quote that I am going to give you came from former Chief Justice Earl Warren, who stated, "There is a right of the nation and of the states to maintain a decent society." And he made that quote in a 1964 obscenity case. In dissent, the majority concluded that the material wasn't obscene because of the obscenity test in effect then. Justice Warren disagreed. He felt there was a right of the nation and of the states to maintain a decent society. And I can remember one time wanting to go back to that quote and find out where Justice Warren had gotten it, figuring this will give me a little bit of something to further build my argument. I discovered there was no citation. So here was Chief Justice Earl Warren, considered probably certainly one of the most liberal justices in the history of the Supreme Court. And without having to cite a case, he said there is a right of the nation and of the states to maintain a decent society. And if you go out on the internet, or if those of you who remember Times Square in the old days, if you don't walk over to 8th Ave, walk from about 34th Street up to 50th Street, and you'll begin to get a sense of what it means to lose a decent society. I'll stop with that.
All right. Rachel?
Hi. I'm going to just give a little background and then address some of the things that the other panelists have talked about. When I was in college about 10 years ago, I was anti-porn, and I thought that all porn was degrading and anti-feminist. And the thing was, I had never really seen any porn, and that is kind of what I had been taught, and it sort of made sense to me. And then the first time I watched a porn video, I liked it, and I was turned on by it, and that was a struggle for me because this was something that I had written about and thought about, and I had thought that I was right. And actually, if you Google my name, and if you're like me and you go to the end of the Google search, my name is on an Andrea Dworkin supporters website, which later I stopped subscribing to those views. But what that experience taught me was that watching a porn video or looking at porn, it doesn't have a single meaning. It doesn't mean that everyone who watches that is going to walk away with the same impression or the same thoughts. And I think that the idea that an image in and of itself can be degrading or can it just universally means that, I don't think we can say that any more than we can say a certain painting means something or a certain movie. I mean, everyone who looks at that might have a different reaction to it. And so through that experience and through exploring more porn watching and just being more open to it, I kind of realized that you can come to porn with different backgrounds. I mean, you don't have to like all the porn that you see. You don't even have to watch it. I think there's this idea that it's sort of being forced upon us, and I don't necessarily agree with that. And as Brooke said at the beginning, porn has also fueled all sorts of technological advances, from the VCR to the internet to now podcasting and video casting. And I think that this constant expansion shows that there is a huge appetite for porn. And I don't think it was said that it's the people over there on 8th Avenue. I mean, I would venture to say that there are plenty of people in this room who have consumed and purchased porn as well. I don't think you can't look at someone and say whether, they've watched porn or not, or they like it or not. And along the same lines of not everyone having the same reactions to it, Pamela argues that porn is driving a wedge between husbands and wives and sort of interfering in relationships, and that it's the men who are becoming addicted to the porn and women who are offended by it, and that it's teaching men to see women as sexualized objects. And she used the word intoxicating earlier. And I think that for the people who it is having those effects on, I mean, I don't think we can blame all of their actions on porn. I think that if it is causing a problem in a marriage, I mean, that's a problem within the marriage that porn might be exacerbating, but I don't think that the porn can just start that problem. And I also think that there are plenty of couples and people who learn from porn, and that it can be educational, that they can see what they like and what they don't like and what's out there. And I think porn is a lot of people's first exposure to what sex is. And so they're learning about things that they're naturally curious about. I also just wanted to touch on the obscenity law. I think that, especially the way our obscenity law is now defined, that there's not really it's such a subjective thing to say what's obscene, and I think it's very easy to say, well, this website or this, I mean, when you say, oh, well, everyone's going to agree that that's obscene, you're marginalizing people who might not think that's obscene. And I actually, I think that the whole way the Supreme Court has gone about defining obscenity really through the use of community standards basically means that if we're going to say that community standards are what we're going to go by, not only is that totally subjective? That basically means that if the majority of you don't like what I want to watch, then I'm not allowed to watch it. And I don't agree with that. And I also want to say that I think part of what the expansion of porn, especially in recent years, has meant is that people can make alternative films, and there are newcomers, especially women, who are making their own websites and videos, and there's a new breed of younger people who have access to these materials and who are doing something to try to change things within the porn world that they don't like, that sites like Suicide Girls, Burning Angel, there's people like Candida Royale who came from the porn industry and makes women-centered films, and I think there's even more of that now because it's very easy to do, and so there are people from the inside of the industry as well who are trying to change what we see.
All right, thank you. Let's applaud those opening statements. When I was looking into pornography as the engine of communications technology, and we went back to movable type, I think the third book that came off of one of those presses was an Italian pornographic novel. When we went to still photography, it was basically pictures of naked girls. And I interviewed Douglas Rushkoff about this, and he told me that back in the early days of photography, a man would customarily pay more for a picture of a girl than they would to actually spend the night with that girl. And I think the point there was his feeling that porn sex is just a different thing. It isn't a substitute for, but it's actually a different experience from real life sex. And that it isn't just that the girl isn't going to judge you or make fun of you or that sort of thing, the picture of the girl, but that it's actually a different experience. And I know Mr. Peters was talking about assertions that have been made in various court cases regarding the impact of pornography on families, on relationships, on children, and so on. And it seems that before we can even get into a discussion about how one ought to, or if one ought to regulate this kind of material, we need to sort of get a grip on what the impact is. And so I thought I would just ask the panel one by one, does anybody really know what the impact of pornography is? Pam?
Well, I want to start first. I just want to clarify something that Nick said, it's clear from what he said that he hasn't read my book, and I'm not offended.
Actually, I
haven't read the last
have read the
issue
book.
Of Reason, but the last chapter of my book is called The Censure, Not Censor Solution. As a journalist, obviously, I'm pretty fond of the First Amendment, and I also argue that the place to really do something about pornography is certainly not the legal arena and not the courtroom. Porn, I think it's very clear, is a big business. It's a question of supply and demand. And I think actually Nick and I agree in the importance of personal individual choice. And what I'm trying to do is to give people information and to create awareness about the negative side of pornography, because I do think that we have this sense that porn is just harmless fun. And I think that it's important for people to be aware of the fact that, again, and this is coming mostly from the mouths of porn fans themselves, that there are negative implications to using pornography. I also want to make it clear that Rachael said something about porn addiction. It's a controversial idea. There were people who considered themselves porn addicts who I interviewed for the book, and I really separated them into their own chapter, because I think it's porn use, the casual user, it's very different from porn addiction, although I think that there is a bit of a slippery slope, and maybe more people in the age of the internet slip into porn addiction than they might have otherwise. But it's like alcohol. I mean, you have people who drink on occasion, you have people who drink every day, you have people who might be problem drinkers, and they're still not alcoholics. And I think you could say a similar thing with porn. I also think I'm delighted by the statistics that Nick read out. I think that, again, it's very hard to prove causation, and there were a number of other sort of social, cultural, political changes during those periods, and I think it'd be very hard to attribute what would be to pornography and what might be to, for example, increased sex education, although unfortunately we're turning the clock back there. So I think that, again, that's one of the reasons why I don't focus on pornography as a cause of rape or sexual violence, that it might well contribute to, in certain cases, someone's proclivity to commit a sexual crime. That very may well be. I don't think it can be proven definitively. And then now to address finally your question.
Well, I do definitely want to get to censure legislation and all of that later, but I thought we would lay the groundwork with just what we know and what we don't know about the impact of porn.
I mean, and that was the question that I asked, because, it is a huge business. Anyone, I think, with their eyes somewhat half open, can see that porn has become, increasingly ubiquitous and acceptable. And my question, as I said earlier, was, well, there's this enormous supply. Who's the demand? Who's using it? And how is it affecting them? And that's really what I tried to figure out from my research. I think, as you pointed out, porn is not the same as sex. I think we tend to conflate porn and sex, so that if you're anti-porn, you're anti-sex somehow. I actually think it's more pro-sex to be anti-pornography, because, as you pointed out, pornography isn't having sex. It's pretty much not really having sex. And
I wasn't necessarily saying that you shouldn't consume pornography because it gets in the way of having sex. I wasn't drawing that
right,
that
no,
correlation.
But I'm saying that it's obviously you're not having if you're watching porn in general, you're not having sex. Although some people do watch porn while they have sex, and I talk to them in some detail about that for my interviews. But I don't have a problem with masturbation or fantasy, and I think that they have their role, certainly. What I was talking about when I talk about the negative effects, and again, this is coming from guys who like porn for the most part, although some of them had decided no longer to use it. Men, and I want to talk about the effects on men, because I think that we always talk about the negative impact of porn on women. What was interesting to me is that a lot of men who consume porn didn't consider themselves to have a problem, looked at porn, maybe a few times a week. Some of them looked at it every day, had noticed that their enjoyment of intercourse with their partner, or whoever they were dating or married to, had decreased as their consumption of pornography increased. Men told me they had trouble maintaining erections, that they had trouble achieving orgasm during regular intercourse, that often they had to emulate what they saw in pornography. Those of you know the money shot is the sort of proof of the consummation of the act in pornography. So many of these men felt that while they used to not have to do this, they actually had to do this, whether they wanted to or not. It was ejaculated on their whoever the women they were with's face or breasts, as they often do in porn, in order to consummate the act, or they had to withdraw in some way and take care of business on their own. And this was something that they were not saying was something desired. This was it bothered them, and they felt that this is not the way they wanted to have sex. There were other men. There were two interesting ways in which pornography sort of infiltrated their mind while they were having sex. One was deliberate and the other not. For many of the men who are having trouble achieving orgasm, they said that often they had to they sort of had to conjure up images of porn in order to maintain their excitement and get off. And then this was, again, something they didn't desire, because they felt like, well, why can't I just sort of be in the experience and enjoying it in and of itself? Why do I actually need to think about this other thing? For some men, they felt that they didn't want to think about pornography. They were trying to focus on their partner, but that porn would kind of sort of seep into their mind while they were having sex. And, kind of like you get a song in your head that you can't get out. You don't even necessarily like the song. And that was what happened. And they would say, I actually don't want to be thinking about, Jenna Jameson while I'm with my wife. That's kind of its own separate thing. And so they had trouble in certain ways just distinguishing between what had once seemed like a private fantasy alone thing from what was the reality of the relationships or the sexual experiences that they were trying to enjoy in real life.
But I mean, that's very interesting. On the other hand, it's, bad things happen to you if you drink too much too, and so
sometimes good things do too.
Well,
or good things. But I mean, you cut back. I mean, this is it. It's if it has this deleterious effect on some of the people you talk to, it doesn't necessarily define it as a social ill, one that needs not to mention censor, one that might even need censure.
Well, I do think that, again, there are a lot of things that some people might think of as, a good thing or a bad thing. Chicken McNuggets, people enjoy them. They taste good. Do we want to eat Chicken McNuggets every day? Not necessarily. Should we know that there are health consequences to eating Chicken McNuggets every day? Sure. And that's
The question is
idea.
why are we talking about pornography then? What
Okay.
makes that so much more important than alcohol or Chicken McNuggets?
Well, it's interesting because I get that question a lot. People say, why are you blaming people's sex lives on pornography? I didn't write a book that's what's wrong with everyone's sex life, and I could write about 10, dozens of reasons about what's wrong with people's sex lives. I wrote a book about pornography and to say, well, this is the role that this plays. Now, there are, I'm sure, many other problems that these particular men might be having in their personal lives or in their social relationships that might be contributing to this, but I'm saying that this is one factor, and that in looking at pornography, what we've said so far is that it's harmless entertainment, and we haven't even entertained the idea that there are negative consequences. So it's not that it's solely responsible for destroying everyone's sex life. That's it would be a ridiculous generalization and oversimplification of people's sex lives, which we all know are incredibly complicated and individualistic. It's simply saying that there is a negative role that pornography plays and that people should be aware of it.
Nick, do you want to talk about what we know and what we don't know about the impact?
I do want to point out that I actually started having sex in the 90s in order to get the Macarena out of my head. It really hasn't worked either. That's the worst thing. It keeps coming back. It's the beating of a hideous heart. Well, there's a couple things, and if we're going to talk about censorship later, then we can revisit that, because I did read Pamela's book, and I think a fair reading of it would be that there's a creeping sense of censorship in that book, and I looked at the end of the censure, not censor paradigm, and I was hopeful, but in fact that we can have an argument about where your arguments lead or what's already embedded in them. What do we know about the effects of porn? What do we know about the effects of violence? I've actually studied that more. And the fact is, I think Rachael was saying this, and actually, Pamela, in your book, one of the things that was interesting in some of the more extended interviews that you did with people, you learn a couple things. One is that there is no set response, that it's an individual response which changes over time. And like all images or like all art, your reaction to it changes. It's different than mine, it's different than somebody else's, et cetera. One of the things that's interesting in both in violence, studies that try to make a link between aggressive images and aggression in real life, the real distinction is not even what's on the screen as much as anything else, and I think this holds up for sex as well. There's a distinction that's made between people who watch like 6 or 8 hours of TV in a row, or people who play video games for 8 hours in a row, or watch porn for 8 hours in a row, or do it in a reliable, long-term way, and that's really the split. And those people, I'm not even going to say they have a problem. It's a problem if they see it as one, or if they're, if they're engaging in some kind of antisocial behavior that causes problems for other people. But that's the real distinction. And so, like, if you talk to anybody who does anything other than work, and especially if any of my staffers are out there, anybody who does anything other than work 8 or 10 hours straight a day, but if you're doing anything that long, you probably, there's some cause for concern. But so, the basic point is there is no one response to porn. What we do have, and again, this is what's important, and this is for the granny trannies out there, we are in a world on every level where there is more possibilities. There are more possible identities for people that you can pick up and choose, and you can kind of luxuriate in and try on and try out. Porn, I actually don't think porn is the driving force of a lot of this. I think it's kind of a coincidental factor. But you see it in porn because we see it in real life. And this is the type of thing when people say porn has vulgarized our society, it's made our relationships break down. I'm not a complete utopian or a Pangloss about this, but think about it. 30 years ago, when did Deep Throat come out? 72, 73, something like that? Come on, if you're a woman, your life is so much better and you're less objectified than you were in 1973 or 72. And if you're a man, your life is better because you have more possibilities.
We have to conclude there, unfortunately. I want to say thank you to all of our guests, Robert Peters, Pamela Paul, Nick Gillespie, and Rachael Kramer Bussel, and I want to thank the Smith Family Foundation for hosting this event tonight.